Story 1: The Echoes of Room 2717. I had just started my internship at St. Mary's Hospital, a large old building with a labyrinthine interior that seemed to have evolved naturally over the course of its history. The night shifts were particularly spooky, with flickering fluorescent lights and a pervasive silence broken only by the occasional beep of a machine or a distant voice. One night, I was assigned to work the night shift in the old wing of the hospital, a part of the building that was rarely used and had a reputation for being haunted among the staff. It was my fourth night in a row, and fatigue was starting to set in. As I made my way around, I found myself in front of room 217, a room that had been closed for as long as anyone could remember. The door was ajar, which was odd because I was sure it was locked. Pushing it open, I felt a rush of cold air. The room was dark, with only light from the hallway behind me. Inside, I could see the outline of an old hospital bed, covered in a thick layer of dust. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the silent room. There was an unsettling feeling in the air, a weight that made it hard to breathe. As I approached the bed, I noticed a faint whisper, barely audible. It was so quiet, I thought it was my imagination, but as I stood there, the whispers grew louder. Suddenly, the room was filled with a cacophony of voices, each drowning out the others in a language I couldn't understand. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The whispers turned to screams, and I felt a cold hand grab my shoulder. I turned, but no one was there. The room was empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I fumbled for the doorknob, my hand shaking, and finally managed to pull it open. I ran down the hall, screaming behind me, until I reached the safety of the nurse's station. Panting, I tried to explain what had happened to my coworker, Sarah. She listened with wide eyes and told me the history of room 217. Decades ago, a patient had died under mysterious circumstances in that room. Strange events had been reported since then, but the room had been sealed off to prevent further incidents. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of that cold hand on my shoulder, and the whispers haunted my dreams. I never went near room 217 again, but the memory of that night stayed with me. The old hospital building was eventually demolished, but I always wondered if the spirits of room 217 had found another place to haunt in the new building. Story 2: The Haunted Geriatric Hospital. I have worked as a nurse in many different hospitals and facilities, but nothing prepared me for the haunting experience I had at a geriatric hospital 30 minutes from my home. I had experience working with elderly patients, so I thought this job would be easy. I had been working there for only a few weeks when the incident occurred, during my second to last shift at the hospital. I worked the night shift, slept very little, and was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. The patients there were very fond of me, perhaps because I was a young woman in her early 20s, bringing a breath of fresh air to their lonely lives. Among them was a particularly restless patient named Lena. It was my first night with her, and she kept telling me about the voices she heard and a man dressed in black standing in the corner of the room. Her roommate had asked to close the curtains to block out Lena's unpleasant comments. Lena was a sweet woman who often smiled at me, but her forgetfulness and constant talk about the man in black were strange. That night, when most of the patients were asleep, Lena remained awake, terrified of the voices and the man she claimed to have seen. Her fear was contagious, and although I tried to reassure her, I could feel a growing unease. Holding her hand, I told her to breathe and relax, reminding her that she was not alone and that I was just a phone call away. This seemed to calm her down, and eventually she fell asleep. Around midnight, I was in the linen room arranging the trolley when I heard a noise. It was a small, perfectly quiet room with the door closed, so the noise was unexpected. I turned around, saw nothing, and continued to arrange the cart. Suddenly, I felt a large hand grab my shoulder. I jumped and screamed, but there was nothing there. I looked into the hallway, empty and silent. Trembling, I continued my work, trying to shake off the experience. Then, as I filled the cart, I turned toward the door and saw a man in black standing outside the glass window, smiling at me. My scream echoed throughout the ward, waking everyone. The man disappeared and a fellow nurse rushed in to help. When I asked her if she had seen the man, she looked at me in confusion. "What man? There's no one here." We checked all the rooms. There was no sign of anyone in black. My scream woke Lena, who started talking about the voices and the man again. I asked her if the man was smiling, and she looked at me, her expression focused for the first time. "How do you know?" she asked, and my heart skipped a beat. Then she yelled, "Get me out of here. He's coming." Other nurses rushed in to calm her down. I was transferred to another ward that night and went home early, too traumatized to stay. I texted the head nurse the next day, saying that my next shift would be my last. The experience shook me to the core, and I couldn't bring myself to return to that building. I had never had a hallucination before or since, and while lack of sleep might explain some of it, the vividness of the man's image and the feeling of his hand on my shoulder were unexplainable. I hoped it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Story 3. Bacterial meningitis. 3 years ago, I contracted bacterial meningitis while living in South Florida. There was no outbreak, so I don't know how I got it. The symptoms hit me hard. Severe headaches, confusion, drowsiness, nausea, and loss of appetite. But the hallucinations were the scariest part. One day, while I was lying in bed in a hospital room, and my husband was at work, I heard a child calling Mom from downstairs. We had no children. I dragged myself out of bed and looked down the stairs, calling my husband's name, but of course he didn't answer. The headache from standing was unbearable, so I went back to bed. The second time, I heard a voice saying hello from downstairs. Panicked, I called my husband, horrified to hear a child's voice in the house. He heard my distress and left work early to take me to the hospital. While waiting for him, I changed into my pajamas and had to run to the bathroom to throw up. In the middle of the vomiting, I heard another voice outside the bathroom but couldn't make out what it was saying. By the time we got to the hospital, I was in terrible shape. The doctor quickly diagnosed me with bacterial meningitis, explaining that if left untreated, it could be fatal. I was given antibiotics through a needle, and the doctor said I was lucky to have arrived when I did. My husband stayed with me for a few hours, but had to go to work the next day. The nurse assured me that I could call her if I needed to. Although I felt like I was going to die, I quickly nodded. I began to dream of my ex-husband standing by my bed, saying horrible things about my current husband. He patted my head, said he was glad I was okay and that he had come right after my husband left. He went on to say how he hated my husband and wanted to kill him, rubbing my forehead before leaving the room. I often have nightmares about my ex-husband due to our toxic and abusive marriage. I wake up feeling drowsy and dizzy and notice a chair pulled up next to my bed, but no one is there. Confused, I go back to sleep. The next morning, the nurse tells me that my cousin David visited me last night. I don't have any cousins in this state, and David is my ex-husband's name. I tell the nurse about my vivid dream, and she calls the doctor. He explains that the antibiotics can cause delirium, mixing my sleep with wakefulness. I call my husband, who is angry and worried. He came back that night after work, but during the day I texted David, demanding to know why he was visiting and how he knew I was in the hospital. He replied, saying he was just checking up on me and that I must have imagined the threats. I never told my husband about the threats, unsure if they were real or the product of my hallucinations. I left the hospital a week later, but the experience left me shaken, wondering what was real and what wasn't. Story 4. The Abandoned Hospital Stalker. I once matched with a girl named Francesca on Tinder. She had a sleeve full of tattoos, red highlights, and loved to work out. One of her profile pictures was taken on the rooftop of an abandoned hospital, which she said was great to explore at night. Intrigued, I agreed to go with her for our first date. I picked her up and we drove 20 minutes to the hospital, getting to know each other along the way. She led me to a hidden parking spot and we walked to the hospital, hopping over barriers to get to the entrance. We climbed through a broken window into the basement, using our phone flashlights to navigate. Francesca knew the hospital well and led us to a stairwell. It was creepy, especially in the dark. Suddenly, we heard a door slam at the end of the hallway. We turned off our flashlights and waited. Another explosion sounded closer, and we rushed up the stairs, up several floors. When we felt safe, Francesca explained that the police rarely went inside, but other adventurers might. However, we didn't see any other lights. Then we heard footsteps on the stairs below. Someone was following us. We ran through the hospital, trying to get away from them, but the footsteps got closer. We reached the top floor and rested for a while. Francesca suggested walking across the narrow wooden planks that were 10 feet high. I hesitated but didn't want to appear scared, so I followed. We sat on a pillar, swinging our legs until we heard noises below. Shining our flashlights, we saw a man in a black beanie and coat smiling at us. "Come down here," he said in a deep, creepy voice, waving us down. I asked him if he was a cop, but he ignored me, repeating his invitation. We stood up, terrified, and crossed the board back, hearing him leave the room. We knew he was trying to catch us. We ran down the stairs, hearing him chase us. On the first floor, we ducked through the broken window, afraid he would catch us. We rushed to my car, locked the door, and gasped for air. That night was a nightmare, but it created an instant bond between us. We grabbed food at Wendy's to calm down, talking for an hour before I dropped her off. Francesca and I are still friends, but we never went back to that hospital. The memory of the man in black still haunts me, a reminder of how quickly a thrilling adventure can turn into a fight for survival. If you like creepy true stories that take your breath away, then you've come to the right place. On this channel, I share the scariest real-life encounters, haunted experiences, and unsettling mysteries from around the world. Every week, you'll be immersed in stories that will make your heart race and your mind wander into the uncanny. Don't miss out on the thrills. Hit that subscribe button now. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload, and be part of the conversation in the comments. Your support keeps these haunted stories coming, so subscribe today and prepare to be scared.